Okay, so welcome to this class. I think it's right around the 7th class or so of this series that I'm doing on chapters 4 and 5 of Master Shantideva's text. Let's start tonight, as we usually do, with a few prayers. So let me pull that up on screen and let's see where, there it is. Okay, good. Let me get this out of the way on my screen. Okay, so we've been doing this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, this homage. Shakyamuni Buddha, of course, the founder of this tradition, who has all these amazing qualities that we're counting in this praise. We want to have that strong connection to the Buddha and a desire to be blessed, to receive the inspirations of the Buddha so we can become just like him. So let's recite this together 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. So then we will do this short mandala offering. Again, this is a prayer where we visualize the phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful paradise, symbolic of our own future pure land that we can achieve through practicing the Buddha's teachings and achieving enlightenment, as well as the same for all sentient beings, that they can also attain this. So we're making this vast pure offering to the refuge field, to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, the 3 jewels, as well as to our gurus, so we can receive their blessings and accomplish that complete purity. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then the final prayer before we do our meditation is refuge and bodhicitta before the teaching. So this prayer encompasses those 2 ideas in the first 2 lines, renewing our sense of safe direction that we find in the 3 jewels of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and this desire to recommit to following the Buddhist path. And then the last 2 lines where we already cultivate that motivation of bodhicitta, thinking that we're here to benefit all sentient beings, to develop our own minds by listening to the Dharma, so we can help all sentient beings to achieve the same state. So let's recite this once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar shog. All right. So let's do a short meditation before we begin then. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, and also I'll lead you in setting your motivation, renewing, refreshing that motivation of bodhicitta. So just find a good meditation posture, one that's suitable for your body. And make sure that the back is somewhat upright and straight, as well as the head, but then also relaxing into this posture, especially releasing tension in the neck and shoulder area, or wherever else you find tension in the body. Just try to soften into those areas. And then breathing naturally, begin to attend to the breath. And no doubt you already have a technique that you use to work with the breath, but if you don't, I generally suggest tuning into the sensation around the area of the nostrils or the upper lip, where we feel the air coming in and out as we inhale and exhale through the nose. And just making that your meditation object, you simply want to stay present with it as best as you can. Again, these two factors that we're working with in this chapter of mindfulness and introspection, we need them both in our meditation. The mindfulness of the breath so that we don't forget that this is what we are attending to, this is what we're doing during this time. And then also the introspection, the sort of spy in the corner of the mind that checks in to see the quality of our meditation. And if we see that the mind has wandered, then we let go of whatever it was that distracted us and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl here to begin the meditation period, and then we'll have a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection. So now let's set our motivation together. I thought I would bring up a topic that I also used in yesterday's class for the Santa Fe group, which is this whole idea of the kindness of other beings. at this time in our world when all of this is going on with COVID-19 and so many people affected by this, we recognize to an even greater degree, perhaps, the interdependence that we have with others. The fact that none of us stands completely alone, separate, apart, but we depend upon others and others depend upon us too, to some extent. But we're going to focus mostly on this idea of how much we depend upon others. We depend upon their kindness. And while a lot of what we receive in terms of this kindness is not intended for us in a very direct way, it's not that the people who are growing the food that we eat, packaging it, shipping it, preparing it, what have you, all of the various things involved in getting food to your plate, those people may not have an intention to benefit you directly. They don't sit in the fields where they're growing the vegetables, and think, oh, Don is really going to enjoy this for dinner tonight. But rather, they do this and we benefit from that. We benefit from their kindness, and we can choose to see it as an unbelievable kindness that others are still dedicated, especially during this time, to producing the food that we eat, to shipping it, and all of the things involved. Right now, we are so dependent upon the kindness of others to keep the lights on in our homes, to continue to have gas in our tank when we go to the store, or whatever it is that we do, to run the buses and so on that are necessary for transportation. I mean, so many people. And of course, all of the other people who are dealing with this epidemic in so many more direct ways. And we may need to depend upon their kindness at some point in the future as well. But we do see when we experience something like this in our world, how much we do depend upon the kindness of others. So really let your heart open up with gratitude, feeling that how wonderful it is that we're the recipient of so many other people's kind acts, all the things that they do that we benefit from. And then from that space of gratitude should naturally come the wish of wanting to repay that kindness. And while most of us might be, simply staying at home, this is an act of compassion and kindness for others, to remove ourselves from the busyness of life so that we don't become a burden on others. It is an act of kindness, but nonetheless, we can do so much more for them. We can generate this motivation that is intent upon helping each and every being without exception to achieve exactly what it is that they desire, to be free from all dissatisfaction and suffering, to attain unparalleled bliss and happiness. This is possible for each and every being, but we do have to develop ourselves in order to accomplish that. We do have to become enlightened, fully awakened, for us to be able to truly help others to the greatest degree. So when we cultivate this mind of bodhicitta that is intent upon achieving Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, we can do it from that place of wishing to repay the kindness of others most completely, in the best possible way. Well, we can't be out, feeding each and every one of them right now. We can't be taking care of them in the way that we would ideally like to. We can generate this strong intention to benefit them that will eventually ripen into that result of your own enlightenment, so you can then help all beings. So hold that mind of bodhicitta very firmly in your heart, so that what we do tonight becomes the cause for repaying the kindness of all beings through our becoming enlightened and then working effortlessly, tirelessly for their sake. Okay, good. Again, so welcome everyone to this class. I'm so glad to see so many of you on board. This is great. So let's go ahead and do a little review of where we're at with this class. This class, we've been working with 2 chapters of Master Shantideva. I had taught on chapters 1 through 3 when I was in New York City in October. Seems like a lifetime ago at this point. And I've been working with chapters 4 and 5 in this course. And again, there are video recordings of these that are available through the coordinators for each of the 2 groups, the Shantideva Center in New York, as well as Namdro Ling study group down in Miami, who are co-sponsoring this set of teachings. So we've been working with in chapter 5 is this idea. Chapter 4 was about conscientiousness, this force that helps to keep our mind on track. It sort of acts like our conscience and making sure that we dedicate our lives the best way possible to benefit others. But then also we've been looking at this concept of guarding introspection, guarding alertness. It's sometimes called watchfulness, the idea that we need to have some way of watching our behavior and what we're doing to make sure that we train appropriately, and especially that we train here in the context of this chapter, chapter 5, in the second of the 6 perfections, the perfection of morality or ethics. So this is again, the general title for this whole one is explaining the way of training in morality by relating it to introspection and mindfulness, the methods for keeping virtuous dharmas pure. So this is how we actually keep our minds on track as well, not just through conscientiousness that intends to move in that direction, but these active parts of our mind, introspection and mindfulness, that keep us aware of what we're doing and corrects things when we are not on track. So we did previously in the first one that we did, first class that we dealt with, chapter 5, we looked at the general presentation of this chapter and the 6 perfections, because this is the beginning of Master Shantideva's working with those 6 paramitas or perfections. Again, the second one being morality that we're working with here. The first one, generosity, isn't really covered until the final chapter, chapter 10. We started last week the individual presentation, which is the sum total of the verses. There are 109 verses in this chapter of Master Shantideva's. So the very first outline within this is explaining the text of the chapter, which does cover these verses, and it has 2 outlines. The very first outline is explaining extensively how to practice, and then there's going to be a little tail end that's only got a couple of verses to it. But this has 4 outlines to it. So this is, again, just to get us into the ballpark of where we were last time. The very first outline that we are still in and working with is guarding the mind as a method for guarding the trainings. So again, this whole text is based on the concept that we initially in the first few chapters look at cultivating the mind of bodhicitta that we just meditated on briefly. When we have that mind very firmly in our hearts, then we need to engage in the practices, the trainings of the Bodhisattva, which are primarily, again, these 6 perfections. So this is what this chapter is to help us to do, is to make sure that we have the tools by which we can continue to engage in the trainings, to do our best to practice the 6 paramitas. So this is an important chapter, and again, it does primarily deal with morality. We will be seeing that as we get into some of the verses tonight, I believe. But this is this little prelude to it is all about these 2 factors of introspection and mindfulness. So if they are the tools by which we guard the mind. And we even saw that in regard to this very first verse. The very first outline within this is protecting all by protecting the mind. In the very first verse of this chapter, Master Shantideva says, those who wish to guard their trainings should very tightly guard their minds. Those who do not guard their minds are unable to guard their trainings. So we see how important it is to master our minds. This is the name of this course. Again, we're calling it Mastering Our Mind, Mastering the Mind, because the first chapter that we looked at, chapter 4, was all about that mental factor of conscientiousness that we need. And now we're looking at some more, again, active mental factors that are active in the moment to keep us on track, to keep us aware of what's going on in our minds and our behavior, and to correct things if needed. The second outline was the reason for this, the reason for needing to guard our minds in order to guard the trainings. And there were 2 parts to this. The first one had to do with the fact that all the faults we have in our practice and in our minds depend upon the mind. So in verse 6, which was there were only 3 verses for this little section of and for that first, that's mentioned in the first verse, the reason for needing to guard the mind in order to guard the trainings. Master Shantideva in this verse says, the perfect speech itself indicated, thus all fears as well as all boundless suffering originate from the mind. So the perfect speech, of course, is the perfect speech of the Buddha, who himself indicated in his sutras that all the fears we have, all the suffering we experience originate from the mind. Of course, all the happiness that we have also originates from the mind. But this is this idea, again, of rooted very much in the teachings on karma, that the principle by which we have experiences, whether they be good, bad, indifferent, is through the power of our own actions in the past, which we can say, yes, some of them are verbal and physical, and then we're going to be looking at that as part of the ethics that the Bodhisattva practices, is to refrain from harming others through body and speech. But everything starts with the mind. Our bodies and our speech don't just do things, and our body doesn't go and take the life of a being without our mind being involved, at least in an intentional way. It doesn't do that. You might accidentally do that, but that, again, is not how karma is generated. Karma is generated through our intention, through the movement of the mind in a particular direction, and then that manifests often in acts of the body and acts of speech. But everything starts from the mind, according to Buddhism, and the mind is the creator of all. Mind is even the force behind creating the world that we live in, the environment that we experience. We can say mind is behind COVID-19. There is no denying that in Buddhist terms. Yes, there's a physical process by which this virus was, jumped from species to species, came into the human species and started working, through all the various countries it's gone through and what have you. We're not denying the science of it. We're just saying, why is that happening to beings in this time? Why is it happening to certain beings and not to other beings? It's all karmically influenced. So again, we just have to keep in mind that that is the backdrop for everything that we're talking about tonight, especially in regard to morality, to ethics, which again is the second perfection. Why it is so important to attend to our morality is because it's through our immorality, our engaging in acts that are harmful to others and to ourselves, by which we experience suffering in our future. And this is, again, part of the law of cause and effect, karma. But it's also, of course, by refraining from engaging in those negative actions and engaging in pure morality that we create the causes for our happiness, for our well-being, as well as, of course, for the well-being of others, because when we stop killing them and stealing from them and lying to them and saying harsh words to them, then they have much more happiness in their life. They don't have to worry about us being a threat to them. So this is, again, the principle behind this first part of this, the reasons for the mind being central, guarding the mind being so important, is because all the faults that we have are arising within the mind. Of course, the other side of it is that all the qualities depend on the mind. This is where we ended last week. There were a number of verses that had to do with this idea of all 6 of these perfections, these paramitas, depend upon the state of the mind, not some external measure, as was seen for generosity in the first 2 verses of that section. So let's look at those again. In verse 9, Master Shantideva says, if the perfection of generosity were the alleviation of migrating beings' poverty, then, since there are still starving migrating beings, in what manner did the previous protectors perfect it? So somebody raises the question, well, if the external measure is necessary to perfect generosity, and we're here talking about material generosity, though there are, again, many other forms of generosity. But if we look at the world that we live in, there are still beings who are poor. Poverty still exists. Well, if the measure is to alleviate the poverty of others, if that was how it was perfected, was an external measure, then you could never achieve that, because the Buddhas have, of the past, have never achieved that. All the previous protectors, the Buddhas, they did attain the perfection of generosity, but there are still beings who are suffering from poverty. So that is obviously not the measure. As Master Shantideva says in the next verse, the perfection of generosity is taught to be the mind intending to give all things, as well as its results, meaning the merit that arises from that mind intending to give all of that to all beings. Hence, it is simply the mind. So this is the idea behind this, is that all of these 6 perfections are cultivated within the mind and perfected within the mind. So again, the 6 perfections are generosity, the very first one that we just looked at, morality, which again is the main topic of this chapter, patience, which will be the top topic of chapter 6, joyous effort or enthusiasm, the topic of chapter 7. Chapter 8 is about meditative stabilization, concentration, which is the 5th perfection. And then finally, chapter 9, which is one of the hardest chapters of the whole book, is dedicated to wisdom, the perfection of wisdom being the last, the 6th perfection. So the measure of attaining the perfection of all of those, the way that the Bodhisattva actually engages in cultivating the perfections, doesn't have to do with some external thing. It has to do with the internal control over one's mind. So this is, again, setting up this whole idea of how we have to guard the mind then, and we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we stay on track, cultivating virtuous attitudes, abandoning non-virtuous ones. So now we are at the 3rd outline. Again, the first one was this whole idea of guarding the mind. The second outline was the reasons for needing to do that, which again had to do with the faults and the qualities, all starting from the mind. This is where we left off last time, was in this next chapter, next outline of this chapter. The 3rd outline within guarding the minds is a method for guarding the trainings. And it's about, 5 verses, striving and guarding the mind, and it has 2 outlines within it. The first outline is showing this, showing that how you need to strive in guarding the mind. So we just have one verse for that. This is verse 18. It says, "This being so, I shall hold and guard my mind well. Except for the mode of conduct of guarding the mind, what use are many other modes of conduct?" So, of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as a lot of other branches of Buddhism, there are a lot of other practices that we could be doing. People could be reciting mantra or reciting sutras or doing prostrations or doing all sorts of other external things that, may look like they're dharma. But if one is not guarding your mind while doing that, if you're just engaging in those external activities without much other thought, well, then they're not going to be so beneficial. Guarding your mind is something you need to do all the time, whether you're engaged in sutra recitation or any of these other things. So here, in regard to this verse, I'm going to share what Gyaltsab says. Again, one of the texts that you also have, rather than just the verses that have been on the screen, but you also have access to the commentary by Gyaltsab. And so this is on page 13 of chapter 5. So if you do have that in front of you, you can follow along. At the top of page 13, he says, "Abandoning faults and achieving qualities depend on the mind, as we just discussed. Therefore, I shall guard this mind of mine well with mindfulness and introspection and not let it degenerate. Apart from the discipline of guarding the mind, what shall one do with the many other disciplines of prayers and so forth? They are unnecessary." Now again, by unnecessary, he's not saying that you don't do them at all. I mean, it's perfectly fine to recite prayers and sutras and do all the other practices, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, that we do. It's just most important to guard our minds, because even if we do all those other things, but if our mind is unruly and our mind is not attentive to what we're doing in our behavior, well then what's the point? All those practices don't amount to much because one hasn't done the deeper work of really focusing on one's own mind. So mindfulness and introspection were mentioned here again. Let me just make sure everyone is clear about what we mean by those 2 terms before we proceed, because they're going to be talked about frequently throughout tonight as well as the remainder of this chapter. Mindfulness is used in a lot of ways, and the way that we've incorporated mindfulness into the West. We all have mindfulness as a factor of our minds. You couldn't drive a car or even read a book or even watch a teaching like this if you didn't have some mindfulness, some ability to stay present with what's going on. So we see that that factor is even necessary for engaging in non-virtue. There's nothing virtuous about mindfulness itself. It simply is a factor of non-forgetfulness within the mind, not forgetting what it is that one is attending to, that one is present with, whether it be the mindfulness we have in meditation where we're focusing on the breath, or whether it be when we are living our lives and wanting to be attentive to the various things that we're doing and saying and thinking as we are going about our lives. So mindfulness is a very important part of our practice. And of course, meditation is one of the ways that we deepen our awareness of what's going on so that our mindfulness becomes more prominent and stronger and used in many, many more ways. So meditation is definitely a part of being able to be mindful of one's behavior and thoughts and so on. Introspection, as I mentioned earlier, it's like that spy in the corner of the mind that is a sort of awareness that checks in at times to see what the quality of our minds and behavior is. And if we see that we're going astray, that we somehow have moved away from that, that we've lost our mindfulness, it's the factor by which we correct things. It's the factor by which we become more aware of what it is in terms of the quality of our thoughts, the quality of our speech, and so on. So this sort of guarding alertness, it is how we guard the mind. The mindfulness keeps us sort of in place, but we can't always have mindfulness unless you have a really deep meditative practice. It's very hard to kind of have it there in a much more prominent way. So occasionally we'll lose our mindfulness and we'll start doing things by habit based on the afflicted states of mind and behavior that we've engaged in the past. Well, at that time, we need introspection. We need this sort of guarding alertness that says, you've gone astray. You're not on track anymore. You need to get back in line. And then we restore our mindfulness and we keep going until maybe our introspection comes in again and sees that we've wandered away again. So this is the force by which we stay on track in meditation, but it's also the force by which we stay on track in our daily lives. If we don't have those two factors strong, as Master Shantideva said, if we aren't guarding the mind through our mindfulness and our introspection, then we are not going to be guarding the trainings. We're not going to be engaging in all of the acts of a bodhisattva, the deeds of a bodhisattva that we need to do. So this is the whole gist behind getting into this chapter then and what we're looking at, especially these two factors of mindfulness and introspection. So continuing with this third outline, this final outline of this first section here, the second part of it after showing is explaining. And this has actually 4 outlines within it. The very first one within explaining this whole idea, striving to guard the mind, is the way of guarding the mind. And this is verse 19. Just as I would be attentive and conscientious of a wound when amidst an unruly freed crowd, so I should always guard the wounds of my mind when dwelling among negative people. So this is an interesting analogy, right? Maybe some of you have even had a time where you had, maybe an arm in a cast or a leg in a cast or something, and you're out on the streets of New York City or wherever, and you're trying to guard that from other people hitting it and causing you injury, causing you to suffer from them coming up against your wounds. And certainly if you had some sort of really sensitive wound, you would want to do your best to protect it so that no one else would cause some abrasion to it and thereby experience that pain. Well, that's a really minor thing in regard to our lives when it comes down to it, because we're talking about guarding our minds so that we don't experience unbelievable suffering in the lower realms and unfortunate existences even within the human realm and so on. So we have to always be guarding the wounds of our minds when we're dwelling among negative people, when we are out and about and just living our lives. So Gyaltsab Je, again, Gyaltsab Je was Lama Tsongkhapa's, one of his 2 heart disciples. And this commentary, he says, same page 13, a person with a wound on his body who is in the midst of a restless crowd will apply himself very strongly to protect the wound. Similarly, if one is in the midst of bad people who will generate afflictions in one's mind, then one needs to continuously guard the wound of one's mind. If one does not guard one's mind, then it will be the condition that cuts off the life of one's higher status and, of course, liberation. So a few things to say on what I just read. I mean, this translation was done by Venerable Fedor, amazing scholar and wonderful practitioner and teacher. But nonetheless, this idea of bad people, I mean, by bad people, we don't mean like kind of inherently bad. We don't mean that there's something really evil about them in terms of something about their essence that is evil. Rather, we have people who are under the control of their negative states of mind, just like we are frequently under the control of our negative states of mind. But if we're hanging out with people who have that proclivity and who will induce us to either get angry at them or to go along with them and doing various things that are not so wholesome, well, then we really need to guard our minds, just as if we were having a wound in a crowd and wanting to make sure that other people didn't rub up against it, bump into us, and us experience the pain of that. So And as I said earlier, as he mentioned at the very end, it cuts off the life of one's higher rebirth or higher status and liberation. Higher status, of course, is the goal in terms of practicing morality, at least initially, is to make sure that we practice good morality so that when this life comes to an end, whenever that happens, we have in place our assurance that our future life will be good, that we will actually be able to continue to have opportunities like this human life, which is a product of our own past actions. You have this human life now, the Buddha says, because of your past actions prior to this life, either in the life before or many lives before, that ripened at the end of your last life and gave you this human existence. Of course, the science was also there too. Your consciousness united with the egg and sperm of your parents and your wombs in the womb of your mother, and your body developed from that, but your being, by virtue of the mind uniting with that, came together in the womb through the force of your good karma. So we want to make sure we have high status. We want to make sure that we continue to have these good opportunities, because for most of us, we need a continuity of good rebirths in order to achieve enlightenment. Through the practicing the tantric path, you can achieve enlightenment in a single lifetime, it said. But as you know, it's a very difficult path, a very arduous path. For most of us, we will probably need a sequence of good rebirths to continue to do this work. And of course, the human life is said to be an ideal existence to be able to practice the path to enlightenment. So that's the first of these, high status. And of course, it also cuts off the potential for you to achieve liberation. Well, how does it do that? Because if you don't guard the mind and you end up engaging in a lot of negative behavior, and that behavior isn't purified in any way, and it does give rise to its results, well, then you might end up in an unfortunate state for quite some time. You know, these unfortunate states, one of the worst things about them is that you can end up being reborn there, they say, for quite a long duration. And so again, whether or not we have a conviction in past lives and all of the things I'm talking about, we can use that as a hypothesis, as a way to work with this and have some impetus to move away from what might cause you future suffering, to adopt and engage in what will cause you future happiness. And again, we just work with these ideas as best as we can. But this is this whole idea of the way of guarding our minds is if we have that kind of idea, well, I need to be as careful with everything I think, I say, and I do as I would be if I was walking around with a gaping wound and trying to protect it from people, you know, bumping into it. If I have that same sort of dedication to wanting to make sure that I don't engage in something that will cause my future suffering, then I've got a strong impetus to guard my mind, a strong impetus to do what Master Shantideva is encouraging us to do in this chapter. So let's go on then to the next part of this, the second outline within this. Again, there are 4 outlines in total that have to do with this idea of explaining what was being talked about. This is the reason why this is necessary. Verse 20 says, if I am conscientious of a wound through fear of the small suffering of a wound, then why do I not guard the wounds of my mind through fear of being crushed by the mountains of mass destruction? This is referring to one of these hell realms that's described in the teachings. But again, regardless of what we believe in or don't have conviction in terms of future lives, we can certainly see in this human life there are a lot of existences, a lot of people who are experiencing unbelievable suffering even as a human. So we should be attentive to this with whatever conviction we have in terms of karma, and have that idea that we have to be really vigilant, really attentive to what we're doing with our minds so that we avoid any future suffering in the same way that we strive to avoid suffering in the moment. You know, if we really think about it, when we are experiencing something that is suffering in the moment, you know, somebody triggering us through what they're saying or doing, at that time, we don't want to suffer, right? We don't want that person to be saying that. We don't want to be hearing those words or experiencing whatever's going on. Just like in the crowd, you don't want to experience somebody brushing up against your wounded arm or wounded leg or whatever. But if we are really intent upon not suffering at that moment, it doesn't make sense for us to react negatively or to not follow the trainings. Why? Because if we don't follow the trainings and we say something negative or do something negative, we're creating the causes for our future suffering. So it doesn't make sense in Buddhist terms for us to think, oh, I'm trying to not suffer, so therefore I'm going to yell at that person or push them away or do whatever. When in reality, if we don't want to suffer, we would do the exact opposite. We would try to be patient and calm. We're going to see this when we get to the chapter on patience. But this is the whole gist of this little, bit of this text is to say we have to have that same kind of concern for our future and apply the teachings appropriately so that we do guard our minds and keep us from committing things that will cause our future suffering. Because again, that's the whole topic that we're going to be getting into with this chapter is morality, which is things by which we create the positive results and have suffering results. So I'm not going to read Gyaltsab Je's commentary on all of these. Let's go on to the third outline, verse 21, the benefits of doing this. Master Shantideva says, should I behave in such a way, then, whether among negative people or even in the midst of women, again, keeping in mind that this is a monk teaching to an audience of monks, and so he was using the example of women as what would entice one, beautiful women that could cause one to lose one's vows of celibacy and what have you. So again, that's the idea behind that third line. The steady effort of restraint will not decline. So whether we are in a group of people that could cause us to go astray and engage in all kinds of other unhealthy behavior, or whether we're tempted to let our lust and our desire go out of control based on whoever it is that we're attracted to, whatever it is that's going on, if we can't maintain ourselves in that environment, that context, then we're going to be in trouble. But if we behave in the way that Master Shantideva is saying, then the steady effort of restraint, refraining from engaging in those thoughts and actions won't decline. We'll have a force behind it, whereby we can maintain our behavior and our thoughts regardless of where we are. So Gyaltsab Je, let's do the commentary on this. It's just a short little paragraph. He says, if one continually practices stopping the afflictions, the stability of the mind, striving in the vows, will not degenerate, regardless of whether one abides in the midst of bad people with much anger, again, people who are under the control of their anger and so on, or whether one abides in the vicinity of a woman with much attachment. So the whole idea is this is very similar to what we saw in regard to how we looked at working with patients, right? We saw that whole idea of the trying to cover the earth with leather rather than putting leather just under our own feet. It's a very similar idea here. If we can control our own minds, then it doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what environment we're in. We get so much into, if we aren't really being attentive to the teachings and working with our minds, we get so much into in our culture controlling the external environment. We want to have everything just right. We've got this like kind of Goldilocks mentality. You need to have the bed just right in terms of its comfort. We need to have the lighting just right and the temperature just right and everything just right. And when the food is served right at the right temperature with the right amount of seasoning and the right this and the right that, we get so attached to making everything kind of correct on the outside. But things aren't always going to be that way, right? We're finding this out right now in our times, what we're experiencing, that we don't always have control over those external factors. We might have to eat food that we don't find as delicious as what we normally might eat. We might have to be in environments that we don't find to be as conducive as we generally like them to be. Well, that's proof right there that what we have to work on is our minds, because our minds are what dictates our experience. And so we can have a very different experience when the world goes awry, when things don't go the way you'd like them to, when you don't get everything just right. So again, the benefit that we'll have by guarding our minds means that we can go anywhere. Just like covering your feet with leather means that you can go anywhere you want and no sharp objects will penetrate. That was used in regard to patience, but it's very similar here, same concept. If we do guard the minds, then we don't have to worry about what's going on in the world around us to some degree, and we can actually even make that part of our path rather than rejecting certain things and becoming really attached to other things and so on. So the fourth outline, the final outline in this section on explaining how we strive in guarding the mind, is generating mindfulness to guard wholeheartedly. So again, we kind of come back to that factor of mindfulness that is so essential. So here Master Shantideva says, it is better to be without gain, honor, body, and sustenance, and it is better to let other virtues degenerate rather than ever to let the mind degenerate. So this concept of maintaining our mindfulness of what we're doing, maintaining our mindfulness of the Dharma, of of more virtuous states of mind that we want to be practicing. This is so important. It's more important that we attend to that than the normal things that we attend to. Taking care of our body, making sure that we're thought well of by other people, making sure we've got enough money in the bank. I'm not saying don't do those things, but recognize that if we do those things and we aren't controlling our minds and we actually engage in unwholesome ways of acquiring resources and so on, then it's not going to be, it's going to be for naught. We'll have wasted all that energy putting it into trying to have all these things that are very transitory and fleeting. Whereas if we actually work with our minds and we engage in those more virtuous behaviors and thoughts, we're going to have something much more lasting from that. So let me read a little bit here from Gyaltsep Je again. Although one gains no food, clothing, and the like, receives no praise, such as people prostrating to you, paying homage to you, and has no livelihood to support body and life, that is still easy. You know, he's kind of saying, even if you have all of that misfortune that's happening on the external world, that's easy. To lose virtue unprotected by the mind is easy as well, but the mind of the great vehicle should not be allowed to degenerate under any circumstances. Of course, when we see that we are the recipient of those unfortunate incidents where we do lose our mindfulness, we're going to have to experience the suffering in the future. That's bad enough that, you know, our future suffering will happen. But as we're being reminded of by Gyaltsep Je here, if we are following the Mahayana path, the great vehicle path, we are trying to become a Buddha for the sake of others, so much more important that we guard minds, because everything we do that is contrary to that is only going to lead not just to our own suffering, but the continual suffering of others. Well, this is, again, this Bodhisattva ethic that we recognize that although, yes, we will be the recipient of the negative karma that we're creating in terms of our future experiences of suffering, it's even worse from the vantage point of the others who will not benefit because we're sliding back down into non-virtue. We are not moving forward and up towards enlightenment. Our bodhicitta is degenerating. We're not attending to the more virtuous states of mind and so on. So everything that we want to do is, again, couched within this motivation of bodhicitta, as we're being reminded of by Master Shantideva here. So this essential idea that generating mindfulness to guard our minds, we need this wholeheartedly, because it's not just our own welfare that's at stake. Yes, when you become a Buddha, it is the apex, the completion of your own welfare. It does get you to a place where you can't go any further. You will have perfected your being. So you are included in that. But the main reason why you're achieving that is so that you can benefit others. So it's not just yourself that will be harmed by not guarding the mind. It's all the beings that you would benefit that are harmed because you haven't attended to your mind. You've let your mind go out of control and keep buying into the delusions and not offsetting them. So this is the idea behind that section, kind of looking at explaining. The next section, let me get back to the slides here. Again, we kind of go back now. We just finished the third section of that one first part. We go back to the first outline, and we're still within the, this is okay. I'm sorry. On this slide, I'm getting you all the way back to the beginning of the text. I just want to make sure that we're sort of reoriented there. Once more, there was that initial outline explaining extensively how to practice. We looked at the first outline, which had to do with this whole idea again of let me go back and get the exact title here, Guarding the Mind as a Method for Guarding the Trainings. So now we're at the second outline, which is Guarding Mindfulness and Introspection, the method for guarding the mind. So if we're not attentive to these two factors, then how we're using them and making sure that we rely upon them greatly, then we won't have the method for guarding the mind. You know, the first part was about explaining how guarding the mind is the method to guard the trainings. Now we're looking at how we actually work with these two. And they will continue to come up through the remainder of this chapter as well. But there's about, 11 verses here that have to do with this idea of how we guard these two factors of mindfulness and introspection. There's two outlines to this. The first outline here is also showing, in a single verse, Master Shantideva giving some statement of what it means to guard mindfulness and introspection. And then we're going to go on to looking at actually this this shouldn't say this has 4 outlines. This says showing, doesn't it? It's explaining that has 5. I'm sorry, I don't know how that got on there. I'll have to erase that in my slides. So this has just got the single outline. We're going to go on to a second outline, which is explaining. So to you who wish to guard your minds, I thus fold my hands and urge you, at the cost of your life, guard mindfulness and introspection. So Master Shantideva is just making it very clear that if we have any intention based on what he just explained in the first 21 verses, the necessity of guarding our minds as the means to attaining the happiness of ourselves and others, then we have to guard mindfulness and introspection. So here Gyaltsab says, you who wish to guard your mind, since one cannot guard one's mind if one is separated from mindfulness and introspection, do not let the mindfulness that does not forget the virtuous object and the introspection that analyzes the situation of the 3 doors degenerate. So the 3 doors, again, are our body, speech, and mind, the 3 doorways through which we commit action. Mental action, verbal action, physical action. These are these 3 doorways. So it concludes with saying, I, called Shantideva, request this with my hands folded. So again, this is what Master Shantideva is beseeching us, to do, is to say, if you want to guard your mind, if you want to guard the trainings, and by virtue of that you have to guard the minds, then at the cost of your life, guard your mindfulness and introspection. Don't let them wane. So now we get into the next outline within this, looking at guarding mindfulness and introspection, which are the methods for guarding the mind. And this is the explanation. As we saw earlier, there was a showing and then there was an explanation. This has 2 outlines within it. The very first, the faults of lacking introspection. So we kind of get the idea that if we don't have introspection, then we're going to potentially have misbehavior and things that will be not so favorable for us and others. And this has 5 outlines within it. The first outline, in terms of any action devoid of introspection lacks power. So if we don't have introspection together with our action, then we don't have a great power behind our actions. Those actions don't become as forceful in terms of their results. So people who are disturbed by sickness, Shantideva says, lack strength in all actions, right? If we are dealing with an illness, a sickness in the body, especially these sorts of flus and things like that, then we become very weak. We lack strength in terms of our actions. Likewise, the minds disturbed by confusion lack strength in all actions. So what do we mean by this confusion? This is explained by Gyaltsab. He says on page 15 now of Gyaltsab's commentary, a person who is racked by strong illness does not have the ability to work in the fields. We don't have that strength because of what's happening to our bodies. Similarly, a mind that is racked by the ignorance, the confusion of not knowing what needs to be practiced and what needs to be abandoned, does not have any strength for any type of virtuous action. So this idea of if we have the confusion, because introspection is based on the idea that we have something that has informed that introspection. Again, I would assume that you might need introspection if you're engaging in non-virtue to some degree. If you had, as Venerable Rabina often says, if you talk about the factor of mindfulness, which as I mentioned earlier, doesn't have any particular virtuous tone to it, a good jewel thief would need mindfulness, right? If they're going to actually remove the jewels from a jewelry store or from a museum or what have you, they'd need to do it very, very mindfully to make sure that they don't trigger any alarms or leave any fingerprints behind or whatever the case might be. But they'd probably also need this factor of introspection. So we can't say that introspection is only, for the virtuous thing. We have to have something that we are clued into in terms of what our introspection is to help us to do. In this case, to adopt virtue, to engage in what are more virtuous states of mind and behavior, and to refrain from those things that are non-virtuous. So in the context, this is why it's interesting that Shantideva is bringing up these 2 in the context of morality, because this is where we have to initially apply this whole idea of making sure that we are attentive to what we want to follow, to not engage in misbehavior, non-virtuous action, to do what we can to further more virtuous action and thoughts and so on. So through the force of this factor of introspection, we are then clued into what's going on. I mean, introspection has to have an analysis going on to it. When it comes into our field of awareness, that sort of spy in the corner of the mind, and it checks up what's going on, it's going to be looking at it from the vantage point of seeing either we're on track and doing what we need to be doing based on the teachings and the trainings, or we aren't. And it's going to correct it on the basis of we aren't, and it's going to, try to further and keep going in the direction if you are. If you are already following the trainings, that's great. The introspection is not as necessary. But if you've gone astray, then you need this introspection. It kind of keeps you on track. So we need sort of the power, the force of that introspection to keep everything moving forward. If we don't have that, then we lose our mindfulness and we start engaging in misbehavior and nothing happens. We don't have that factor sort of checking in and keeping us on track. So this is the confusion that Master Shantideva is talking about in verse 24, which I'll again put back up on the screen now. So again, likewise, the mind's disturbed by confusion, by this confusion of not knowing what is right, what is wrong, and applying that factor of introspection to correct things, lack strength in all actions. We don't have that power behind it to maintain a stream of virtue, to maintain good behavior as often, frequently as we can. So the second outline within this, again, there are 5 outlines in total for this section on explaining, is that one does not generate pure wisdom. So this is, again, if one loses one's introspection, then whatever has been heard, contemplated, and meditated by those whose minds lack introspection, just like water in a leaking vase, will not remain in mindfulness. So this idea, again, that if we engage in the wisdoms of hearing, contemplating or thinking, and meditation, these are the 3 wisdoms that are the heart of the Buddhist path that we initially take in teachings like we're doing tonight here. And there's already some level of understanding that occurs just by virtue of me talking these words and putting them on the screen and hearing Master Shantideva's verses. All of this kind of hits home to some degree already, but you have to take these teachings and think about them. This is why I'm encouraging all of you, to go back over these verses that we cover each time over the week and meditate on them even. And the wisdom arising from meditation is when we have a deeper meditative awareness and penetration into these topics. But nonetheless, we have to spend some time thinking about them, mulling them over, analyzing them, seeing if we can see the clarity, the purpose, the message from everything that the Buddha taught, and take it as personal advice. And then we can cultivate that deeper wisdom that comes from applying the teachings. But those who lack introspection, whatever we've heard and accumulated any wisdom through our thinking, through our meditation, that'll be just like water in a leaking vase. So if we have a vase that's got a crack in it, a hole in it or something, we put water into it, but the water just drains right out. It doesn't have any way of being retained and held onto and growing and developing. So, this is the antidote, of course, to this is having introspection. If we actually have the awareness of what's going on and maintain an awareness of the teachings because we've come to understand them as what we need to practice, that we actually need to adopt a virtue, we need to abandon non-virtue. Through the force of that introspection, we will keep that from happening. So I think I did add, here from the other commentary that I've been referring to occasionally, which you don't have, that's why I'm putting this on the screen, is from Abbot Dr. Geltson's Precious Garland, his commentary on this text, which Ziggy To from the Master's Program, a good friend of mine, she translated this, and this was used in teachings that I'm accessing here and there from my teacher, Geshe Jampa Gyatso, when he taught this in Italy. In that text, he says, if introspection is missing, wisdom will not become excellent. First, because for those whose minds lack introspection, even though they once had the wisdoms of hearing, contemplation, and meditation, they will degenerate. Just like, for example, water in a leaking vase drips away without remaining. So this is the idea from the point of view of the past. Even if you've had these things in the past, if you don't have the introspection in the moment to apply that wisdom in terms of how you're going to live your life, how you're going to practice moment by moment, then it's like it's going in, but it's not really being retained, and it's just leaking out. You're not actually utilizing it. And there's a second reason that those who lack introspection will have this consequence, because due to the degeneration of introspection, in the future, they will not remain in mindfulness and their wisdom will degenerate. So this is this whole idea that even in terms of the future, if you don't maintain that introspection, you can't expect that you're going to have a strong ability to retain the teachings that you're getting, to be able to develop them and make them more experiential, because you will have let them slip away by virtue of not having that introspection, that guarding alertness. So this is this whole idea of how we actually work with the Buddha's teachings, again, especially with regard to this whole concept of morality, what we need to refrain from, what we need to engage in. Whoops, sorry. The third outline of these five, one does not generate pure morality. So not only do we lack the pure wisdom, because that wisdom is sort of draining through us because we're not having introspection, we also will not have pure morality. So Master Shantideva says, even those who have plenty of hearing, faith, and diligent endeavor will become sullied by a downfall due to the fault of lacking introspection. So even though we might have plenty of these other qualities, through our own having heard the Dharma, we have great faith in the Dharma, conviction that the Dharma and the Buddha and so on are reliable and are able to protect us from suffering, all this. And we might even put some diligent effort into the teachings to some degree, we will still end up having a downfall somewhere along the line because we're not having introspection. We're not having that awareness, once more, of what it is we need to adopt and what it is that we need to abandon. So here, I'll read Gyaltsab Je's commentary on this one. He says, a person without introspection, this is page 16, I'm sorry, a person without introspection will be robbed by the thief of the afflictions of their earlier accumulated wealth of merits due to degenerated introspection. Oh, I'm sorry, I was reading the wrong one. I got to go up one. This is verse 26, sorry. So reverse. A person with faith, he says, who has listened to many teachings and strives strongly in many different ways to practice virtue, but who has the fault of not having introspection that knows what is right and what is wrong, will be sullied by the pollution of the dirt of the downfalls. Therefore, one should strive in guarding introspection. So once more, I don't know that I need to say much more about that, but it's the same message that whether you're talking about accumulating wisdom and being able to have pure wisdom, or whether you want pure morality, you need that attentive factor. You need that part of the mind that is going to be always analyzing and watching and seeing, are we doing what we need to be doing, moving in the right direction, or are we falling prey to the delusions, the afflictions, and moving in an opposite direction? I can't emphasize this enough. This is really an important teaching because it's the means by which we actually make progress. We might have been studying the Dharma a lot, many, many years, but if we don't have this introspection, it can be really severe in terms of its consequences. The fourth outline that I had started to read the commentary from, the earlier accumulated virtue is destroyed. We might even destroy some of the virtue that we've created in the past by virtue of having non-introspection. So he says here, the thieves of non-introspection, lacking that introspection, in following upon the degeneration of mindfulness, will steal even the merits I have firmly gathered, so that I shall then proceed to lower realms. So here, Gyaltsab Je says, a person without introspection will be robbed by the thief of the afflictions of their earlier accumulated wealth of merits due to degenerated introspection, which forgets the virtuous object. So when we are unable to retain the virtuous object that we want to be focused on, virtuous behavior, virtuous speech, and so on, if we lose that, then we might end up saying and doing things and thinking things that could be our downfall, could, destroy all of the merit we've accumulated from the past. So this is this idea that we're going to actually see, to some degree in chapter 6. It's one of the first verses in the chapter on patience, where Master Shantideva says that anger, which is the opposite of patience, patience is the antidote to anger. Anger is incredibly destructive. It's said that if you get angry at a bodhisattva, for example, if you are a non-bodhisattva getting angry at a bodhisattva, that the amount of merit that you can destroy by those moments of anger that you have is phenomenal. It's, huge amount of virtue that is gone. It's just not there. It's not like it's blocked in some way. It's actually destroyed. This is why we need to protect our virtues as much as possible and to not engage in those negative behaviors and minds. This is why we need introspection, is to make sure that we have that awareness so that we don't let the mind fall prey to the afflictions. So this is, again, just more advice to make sure that we don't lose our introspection. The final outline, the fifth outline in this section on the faults of lacking introspection, is that it obstructs the achievement of virtue not accumulated earlier. So it keeps us from engaging in future virtue as well. It doesn't allow us to, produce virtue going forward. So Master Shantideva says, this host of thieves of the afflictions will search for an opportunity and occasion, and having found it, they will steal my virtue and destroy even life in a good migration. So if we don't attend to it now, the thieves of the afflictions will continue to plague our minds. We won't have the introspection that can block them, and they will keep us from potentially getting a good migration, getting good qualities within that rebirth so that we can use that life meaningfully and purposefully. We depend upon our practice of virtue for everything that brings us some measure of freedom, opportunity, leisure to be able to use our lives meaningfully. So this is how the thieves of the afflictions continue to plague us if we don't do something now to make the force of our introspection quite strong. So here, a very short commentary from Gyaltsep J. This is on page 17. He says, this gang of affliction robbers, it's kind of an interesting way of putting it, this gang of affliction robbers looks for an opportunity to steal the wealth of virtue. If one does not protect oneself with introspection, and they get a chance, they will steal one's virtue and also destroy the results, happy migrations, and the life of liberation in the progress of doing that, by way of doing that. So these faults that we've been looking at are more impetus for us to be really diligent and to look at how we need to have this factor that is attending to our minds all the time. As I mentioned earlier, this comes strongly through the force of our own practice of meditation. If we don't have a really strong meditative practice, we have some ability to work with the mind, but it's not going to be quite as prominent, quite as powerful. With introspection and mindfulness being there during our meditation period and working with the teachings in that context, then when we get up off the cushion, we have everything kind of in place to keep us on track. There are times when I'm giving meditation instruction to people and I'm advising them in terms of what we're doing often in our meditative practice is we're like corralling wild horses, got all of these normal thoughts that are all kind of crazy in our mind, and we bring them all into a nice little contained area, which is sort of the settling that happens when one engages in a nice meditative concentration. We don't have the tendency for these things to arise because we've calmed the mind to a great degree. And we've done that through the factors of mindfulness, being present with the meditation object that we want to focus on, and then the introspection that corrects whatever's happening so that we stay with mindfulness of the breath or whatever topic we're meditating on. But then if we get up off the cushion, it's like leaving the gate to the corral open, and then the horses just all go wild again. And then we have to corral them all again when we sit on our cushion, and then they go wild again when we get up, and then we have to corral them again. So I think what Master Shantideva is trying to emphasize in this is that if we don't have this force of introspection that carries over from our meditation, as well as the mindfulness that is such a key factor as well, then it's going to be very hard for us to control our minds, to guard our minds, to do what we need to do throughout our day to make sure that our behavior is consistent with what it is that we're learning, consistent with what it is we're meditating on, what we're reading about, what we're, trying to practice through all of these teachings. So this is, again, a very important section of this, and we're about to get into, the actual exploration of the morality, but we still have another little section to go through before we get into that. And that section is the second outline under explaining, kind of finishes off this, and that's that guarding mindfulness as the method for guarding introspection. It's kind of interesting. These two work in tandem. We can say sometimes mindfulness is guarded so that we can guard our introspection. Sometimes we guard our introspection so we can guard our mindfulness. I don't know that there's a definite set order for these two. They work in tandem. They're like a duo that can very quickly come to our aid and help us at various times. But this has two outlines within it, this topic. The first outline, as we've been seeing with a lot of these, is showing, kind of in a single verse, Master Shantideva giving the gist of this topic of guarding mindfulness as the method for guarding our introspection. And then we'll go into an explanation. So in verse 29, Master Shantideva says, "Therefore, I shall never let mindfulness depart from the doorway of my mind. If it goes, I should recall the harms of the lower realms and closely place it there." So this is this idea of if we lose our mindfulness, we have to have that strong determination to maintain our mindfulness. And that is how we actually make sure that our introspection is already kind of valid. It's already being used. But if our mindfulness goes away, if we aren't aware of what we're doing and we lose that through forgetfulness, then we should recall the harms of the lower realms. This is what our introspection is to help us to do, is to say, oh, you want to go in the path of virtue, because the path of non-virtue leads to these unfortunate situations. And again, it's not just unfortunate for yourself, but from the Bodhisattva mentality, it's also unfortunate for others, because if we end up in the lower realms, we can't benefit beings to the degree that we can in this human life by developing our minds further towards Buddhahood. So we have to closely place the mind back on what it is that we need to do, back on our behavior, back on our being in line with the teachings. So here, let me put the screen off and I'll read from Gyaltsab Je. This is page 19 now. His commentary on this verse says, because there are many faults, if one does not have introspection, as we just saw in those 5 outlines that we looked at under the previous topic, if one does not have introspection, do not send mindfulness away from the door of the house of the mind. In case mindfulness weakens, remind yourself of the sufferings of the lower realm. Immediately protect the house of the mind again. So again, this is how these two work kind of in tandem, is that we have this mindfulness that is informed by what our introspection has been doing in the background, kind of looking at it and going, okay, here's the situation. You need to follow this track in order to maintain virtue. And if you follow that track, you're going to be in trouble. And then the mindfulness sticks with what it is we need to do on the basis of that information. And it will continue, but if it wanes, then we need to regenerate that force that will say, you need to get back on track. If you don't get back on track, you're going to start going astray down this way or miss an opportunity to engage in virtue or whatever the case might be. So this is how they'll work in tandem. Eventually, if we do have perfect mindfulness, if we are able to stay present with everything that we intend to do throughout our day, then introspection perhaps is not as relevant. It's not something that we need to have as active, because our mindfulness is so strong that we can actually stay true to what it is that we want to do. But for most of us, we don't have that yet, right? We have mindfulness for some period of time. Oh, that's right. I want to be aware of this and going in this direction and maintaining my bodhicitta motivation throughout my day and what have you. But it wanes. It goes, the afflictions come in and they take us away from that. And suddenly we're all caught up in excitement and attachment and desire and all these things, or anger, frustration, irritation. And we've lost it. We lost the plot. We need to get back on target. That's where introspection pulls us back into line. So let me stop right here before I go on to the explaining part of this, which I'd like to finish tonight if possible, but I do want to see if there are any questions or comments, because it's about 15 minutes till the end of class, and I usually like to have a little pause here and see if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or add. You have 2 options again. You can unmute your mic and ask a question, or you can put something in the chat box.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Sunny. I know I'm on Media Center is what it says, but my name is Sunny O'Neill.
Right.
I'm interested in what you have to say about improving meditation, and more importantly, how to go about improving meditation. The basics, we all sit down, the physical structure of the body, how to, but yeah, can you talk about how to improve meditation in the mind?
Okay, it's a pretty big topic, but let me just say a few things.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sunny.
Thanks.
Yeah. Again, each of us is going to be at a different stage of that. Is one of the difficulties is because some people have been meditating for many, many years. Some people maybe are new to meditation. So it gets to be a very hard thing to answer in a blanket way for everybody. But again, in Tibetan Buddhism, we always talk about two types of meditation, and we need these factors of introspection and mindfulness for either one of them. But how we develop them probably initially is through the first type of meditation, which is stabilizing meditation. And this is where, just like we did tonight when we started, we spend some period of time. And here, when we do these classes, it's very brief because we don't want to spend 20, 30 minutes meditating on the breath before we have a class, because that's most of our class time. But you want to spend some period of time focusing on a single object as much as you can. For beginners, it's important that in that stabilizing meditation that they work with it in a very gradual way. So you might look at some instruction. It says to meditate for a half an hour on the breath or an hour on the breath. Well, most people at the very beginning don't have the capacity for that. So I always encourage people to work in very small increments of time. Something no more than even a couple of minutes. Maybe initially it might be only like 3 to 5 minutes that somebody works with meditating on the breath. And you can work with now that everybody's got all these smartphones and devices, you can find meditation apps that you can put in the timing and the timing between meditation periods, so that you can have like a 5-minute meditation period, then a 1-minute rest, and then a 5-minute meditation period, a 1-minute rest. So for very beginners, I think it's good to work in really small increments of time. And then you kind of get a feeling for how the mind is during those smaller periods of time. I remember Pema Chodron in one of her teachings, she said that when she did her first period of meditation, she remembers hearing, the gong go off at the very beginning. And then she was like, oh, this is wonderful. I'm getting into this space. And then the next thing she remembered was the gong going off some 20 or 30 minutes later. She doesn't have any, idea what happened in between. Well, usually what happens in between is that the mind wanders a lot. And especially for beginners, that's the problem. So if you cut it down to a very small amount of time, I think it's really useful. And even more advanced people might try that every now and then to really get a feeling for how good their meditative concentration is to just work with a 5-minute period of staying focused on the breath or staying focused on whatever object you're meditating on. But then as you develop more skill and ability with staying present with the object, your stabilizing meditation should become longer. And eventually, every one of us, if we're aspiring to achieve any great realizations on the path, we have to go through the steps of meditating that lead us to attaining calm abiding. Calm abiding is where we are able to maintain single-pointed focus on an object that is virtuous, that we're holding in our awareness for as long as we want, without any physical or mental disruption. We'll be able to have great fluidity, serviceability with regard to the mind and the body. This is a pretty high achievement, but every one of us should be striving to eventually attain that. And we do that through every day having some meditative experience, being able to focus some part of our day, no matter how long it is, at least some portion where we are engaging in that type of single-pointed focus. So there's a lot of other things that influence all this that it would be kind of beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here. But the idea is if you're working with an object, could be the breath, could be, again, visualize Buddha is one of them that's recommended quite frequently. You want to at least spend some portion of your day trying to deepen that single-pointed awareness. And of course, there's great instruction about how to maintain that. We essentially have two forces that are kind of keeping us off the object or drawing us away from the object. One draws us outward, which is what they call excitement, which is when the mind gets caught up in all kinds of external distractions, thinking about things from the past that are much more enjoyable than staying present with the breath, thinking about sensory objects that we would love to be engaging in at that time rather than meditating on the breath. That's how we forget the instruction and lose that through the force of what's called generally excitement. The other factor is the drawing in of the mind, making the mind very dull and unfocused. It's akin to the feeling of sleepiness that arises sometimes, but it can sometimes even be just like a fogginess of the mind, where we don't have that kind of sharpness and clarity and acuity. That factor can go in, again, a variety of different ways, but it doesn't allow you to have that vibrant focus. A lot of people think that meditation is just kind of zoning out and having this beautiful little experience of being not doing anything. It's a very active process. It's actually a lot of work to meditate. And we need to keep the mind attentive to the object that we're focused on in this type of meditation, stabilizing meditation. So if we have those two factors, one that draws the mind out, one that draws the mind in, then we can't stay focused on the object. And there are, again, many ways to combat that. I'm not going to go into all of that tonight, but that will be coming up as part of Chapter 8, which is on meditative stabilization. The other type of meditation that we also want to accompany our stabilizing meditation with, of course, is analytical meditation. This is what informs our introspection that we're talking about in the context of this chapter. This is where we meditate on the teachings that the Buddha gave so that we can have a greater understanding of them and a greater conviction in them because we've spent time picking them apart and understanding them, having an experience of them in our meditation. So generally in a meditation period, I would encourage you to have one portion of it at the beginning that is pretty much stabilizing, using the breath or some object to get the mind a bit more focused. And then you introduce a topic, and that topic is something that you then investigate and go more deeply into so that you gain some experience of that to some degree. And then when you do get an experience of it, when you begin to get some conviction in whatever it is that you're meditating on, you can go back to stabilizing, but use that as what you're stabilizing on. Don't go back to the breath or something, some other object. Kind of hold tight to that realization, if you will. And it might be a strong word for it at this juncture, but whatever, when you've gotten to that place where you felt that compassion, if you're meditating on compassion, or you really have a feeling for what it means to have death and impermanence in this world, or whatever it is that you're meditating on, then you stay present with that. In the context of this chapter, what we're looking at is having the awareness through our meditation of what is proper, what are the actions we need to engage in, what is it we need to abandon, and some conviction in that based on our own investigation into the law of cause and effect, karma, and so on. On the basis of that, we then have something we can, when we get up off the cushion, that will guide us through our day, that we can try to carry with us. As I said, not let the corral door open so that all the wild horses go away again, but rather keep it somewhat contained throughout our day so that we actually make some progress. So in terms of meditation, those are some basics around it. Maybe it's something you've already heard before, everything I've shared. To really give advice at a more personal level would require knowing more about one's practice and all that, which I don't know that we want to get into tonight. But does that help some, Sunny?
Very much. Very much.
Okay.
Very
All right.
helpful. Thank you.
Okay, you're very welcome. Let me answer the question that's in the chat box. It says, in the commentary for verse 526, there's a sense that introspection is some kind of judgment or superego. Is this a part of what is meant by introspection? Because I don't recall that point in the previous commentaries. I don't know if I don't know. I'm not really good at these Western terms around superego and what have you, or judgment, but I have some familiarity from John Wellwood uses the idea of a spiritual superego, kind of a voice in our heads that acts as a judge of our behavior to make sure that what we are doing is appropriate, and sometimes can become a real problem because it sort of puts us down when we're not living up to the ideals that we would like to live up to. And if it's in that context, I don't know that introspection is meant to be quite so judgmental. Introspection is just a tool. It's a tool that kind of keeps us on the basis of the teachings themselves that have informed us about what we need to adopt, what we need to avoid. It then acts as a guide to keep us moving in that direction, to check in and say, whoops, we're not going in that direction, and then the mindfulness gets restored because we have conviction that that is the right direction through our own previous investigation on the cushion. So I wouldn't want our introspection to get too much of that sort of watchful eye that is judging what we're doing, as much as it is like a companion, somebody who is there to help us, to keep us moving in the right direction. So I don't know. I mean, that's let me look at verse 26 at the commentary that's on there. It says, a person who, with faith, again, who has listened to many teachings and strives strongly in many ways to practice virtue, but who has the fault of not having introspection that knows what is right and what is wrong, will be sullied by the pollution of the dirt to the downfall. So, again, the whole idea was that if we don't have that guarding alertness, that factor in our minds that makes sure that we're moving in the right direction, then we may have those consequences of the afflictions taking over because we haven't been attentive and made sure that we continue in the right direction. So I see introspection in my experience as more like, again, a good companion to keep with you. That, you don't want to lose that ability for that part of your mind to see things quite clearly. Well, again, I don't want to make it sound too like I'm dividing up the mind too much and maybe like in some sort of schizophrenia or something, but we have our normal minds that will follow the afflictions wherever they go. Given free rein, we will just go with them, right? We'll just have a mind out of control with desire. At least this is where most of us start when we approach the Buddha's teachings. Then we need a mind of wisdom, a mind introspection. Remember when I used that definition in the last class, it is an aspect of wisdom. It is knowing what is the proper thing to do based on our investigation of the Buddha's teachings, and then trying to keep us moving in that direction, to correct us when we start falling back into this mindset that is sullied by the afflictions, is going to give us unfavorable consequences. So that's how I see it. And let me know if you have any other comments on that based on what I said, Richard. You can put that in the box there, the chat box. And then Lynn asked, Don, you may have mentioned this, but how do we continue to develop our introspection? Is it through studying the Dharma and virtuous thoughts and actions? I mean, certainly in this context, it means, having the background of having done that study, the wisdom that we've accumulated through that, our investigation through our own meditation, and the conviction that we need to develop to have that. Introspection, again, I guess it's one of these things that just gets developed by use. If we are able to use it on the cushion, especially as a tool to help us to correct what's going on in terms of our meditation, then we gain some experience with it. We know kind of what that part of our mind is like, that sort of spy in the corner of our mind that is helping us, that is trying to make sure that we're moving in that right direction. Introspection, once more, is not something that we want to have present every single moment, because I don't think that it's necessary every single moment. It's there when our mindfulness wanes. Mindfulness is the main thing we want to develop, but the introspection is necessary because sometimes we don't stay on track with purely mindfulness. We lose mindfulness of virtue and we start going in the direction of non-virtue. So that's where the introspection helps to sort of check and see, well, what has gone on here. Even when we talk about in meditation, I'll say that introspection comes in to see if we're mindful of the object that we've been meditating on. Well, there is also, when we wander away, we become mindful of the delusions that are coming into our mind, or the objects of those delusions. So say you're meditating and you're really hungry, and so all of a sudden, instead of focusing on the breath, you start thinking about some delicious meal that you'd like to make for yourself, or to order from some restaurant, or whatever the case might be. Well, you've got mindfulness of that now. Mindfulness can be of anything, as I said. It can be virtuous, non-virtuous. The introspection is necessary so that we let go of mindfulness of some other object and return to mindfulness of the breath, or whatever object it is that we're focusing on. So the idea here is that introspection is something we actually utilize more, and by virtue of utilizing it more, it becomes stronger. It develops through its use. And so just talking about it and giving you an idea of what that aspect of your mind is makes you aware of that wisdom component, that ability to check in. And it will become stronger over time the more that you use it, the more that you actually have experience with it. I don't know that there's anything else that I've heard of as a tool to help us to develop our introspection. Certainly, as you say here, the studying of Dharma and all these, in this context, virtuous thoughts and actions, knowing what's what so you can make appropriate decisions is really quite important. But then the using of it is, because the factor of introspection, it's informed by all of that, but it's the using of it at the time. And you use it on the cushion when you're trying to stay present with the breath or some other object, but then you use it in your daily life when you're trying to stay aware and present with what it is that you're doing. What am I being mindful of at this time that I'm, when I'm watching something on Netflix? What is it that I'm being mindful of when I'm even studying the Dharma? Sometimes we can sit there and be reading the Dharma, but our mind is elsewhere, although we're looking at the words and trying to read them. So introspection is something we actually strengthen by virtue of its use, but it has to be informed by teachings. Otherwise, like I said, we definitely would say that a thief, a jewel thief, is going to need introspection as well as mindfulness. They're going to need to check in occasionally and see, oh, am I being aware that I'm not triggering the alarm by what I'm doing and trying to get the jewel out of this case or whatever. I don't know, I've never been a jewel thief, so I don't know what's all involved in that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's
You're
very
welcome, Lynn. Okay. So unfortunately, we've gotten to 7 o'clock here, 9 o'clock there, so we're at our stopping time. But we'll resume. We'll kind of start by reviewing that verse that we just did, the showing with regard to this section, and then we'll go on to the rest of the sections explaining and so on. So yeah. And then we'll get into, as I said, we're very close to getting into the actual verses that talk about the three types of morality. And so I'll be introducing them in the next class. Again, have no plans to, the next few weeks should be here, should be giving teachings as long as everything goes fine. So I hope that all of you are able to join going forward too. Let me just go back to the board for just one thing on the chat box from Andrea. I hear discipline as you explain introspection. I think discipline can be a part of it. This, again, there's a lot of different translations for this term introspection. Guarding, alertness, watchfulness. They might start sounding like discipline, but again, it's meant to be seen even a little bit more functional though. It's just the ability for us to have some part of our mind that's checking in and seeing what's going on. And then again, not judging or putting ourselves down on the basis of what's happening, just correcting, giving you the impetus to correct because based on what you've been informed by in their teachings, you know what it is that you really want to be doing for your sake and for the sake of other beings. So, and there's nothing wrong with discipline. I think discipline's a word that's unfortunately gotten a really, bad reputation in the English language. Cheryl Huber, who's a Zen teacher, she calls it compassionate self-discipline that we always want to be using. And of course, she's not equating that to this idea of introspection, but it's the whole idea of discipline. We need to have a compassionate self-discipline that's behind all of this. That's like looking at it from the point of view of how do I stop my own suffering? How do I stop the suffering of others? By disciplining my own mind, by taming my own mind. And these are the tools for taming the mind. So maybe it's part of discipline, might be part of a bigger picture, and introspection and mindfulness being tools that we use within that, even conscientiousness that we talked about in chapter 4, also being a part of that. So good questions and good thoughts. I appreciate people bringing this all up. It helps to make the conversation even richer in terms of what we're going through here. So let me page down a little bit here to where we want to do the dedication prayers. This first prayer is where we're dedicating all the merits that we've accumulated for the sake of all beings to become enlightened through our becoming enlightened. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. So through that prayer, we're making that strong aspiration for bodhicitta to develop in the hearts of ourselves and all sentient beings. Then let's dedicate for our precious teachers, beginning with a brief prayer that Rinpoche is advising for His Holiness the Dalai Lama these days, this prayer that he put together. But as we recite these prayers, think that we're creating the causes for all spiritual guides to have good health and long lives, so that we and others will always have perfect guides in our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then for Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then lastly, just very quickly, we'll make dedications for all those that we're holding in our hearts, certainly everyone around the world who's affected by COVID-19, who's succumbed to this illness and death, is dealing with it right now in illness, all the beings dealing with the consequences of this in their world, and especially those on the front line who are battling this through amazing compassionate acts. We dedicate for all of them for their well-being. And then also any individuals that we're holding in our hearts right now, people that we know who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, bring them to mind and dedicate for them. May all of these beings have their suffering quelled and have all the causes that will lead to perfect happiness. And may all beings attain perfect happiness through what we've done here tonight. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate everyone being here. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll reconvene a week from tonight and continue this study. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.